Uh, Good afternoon. I'm Duncan Maclennan, and I'm pleased to be chairing this webinar for CIH, and we're going to take a look at housing policy in Scotland and Wales, ideas for the period 2021 to 2026. I think it's a very timely seminar to have. Of course, we have new administrations, really quite old-looking administrations in some ways, but new administrations in both Wales and Scotland. We have the obvious imperative of COVID recovery and, in a sense, fitting housing best into that, recognising that, as the commentators have said in their videos, that COVID has exposed and unburied, if you like, a lot of the fundamental housing problems that we hadn't resolved in the past 20 years or even longer. So that, I think, is really important. I also think that it's a period, although we're looking ahead 5 years, in the Scottish case longer, of real difficulty and uncertainties, both about the economy and public finances. I mean, the public rhetoric is very much about bouncing back with growth and public borrowing. I think that all of that's much less certain than is often presented. So we may be heading into looking at policy change in quite a difficult time. I think the other really important thing, particularly in the case of Scotland and Wales, is a continuing debate about autonomies at different levels within the UK, or in Scotland's case, possibly not in the UK. And I think that that has some really important implications, not just about relationships with Westminster and policy there, but whether in the perpetually and strongly centralised UK, there will be potential for real devolution within Wales and within Scotland. In other words, we have to focus as much on the relationship with places and municipalities within Wales and Scotland and between them and Cardiff and Edinburgh, as we have done perhaps on the bigger scale. I think that's really important in terms of remaking housing policies and indeed places. So some of these things may come through, but I think that we've had a couple of excellent videos that have brought that together. In terms of the form, if you like, for today, people should keep their microphones are off. Questions, there's a question and answer box. If you put your question in there, I'll try and keep up and pay attention and look at them. And if I will ask you to, in general, to, if your question selected, to pose it. But if you don't want to be seen on screen, then that's fine. Just let me know. So I think these are the main things. I think the conversation is being recorded, and I think these are the main protocols that we have to pay attention to. So let's cut to the chase. I am looking to try and engage people in questions throughout the webinar, but what we'll do is hear first from Ken and from Bob, and then we'll talk to the panelists in a kind of rolling conversation. So first of all, Bob and Ken, thank you for the videos. And Bob, was there anything you, in a sense, wanted to re-emphasize or add to what you had to say? And also, and I don't mean to be difficult here, but was there anything that you thought Ken might have said that you missed out?
Thanks, Duncan. Yeah, I mean, my colleague Pete Mackey did the excellent video for the Wales paper, and so I think summarised that. And I've obviously had a chance to watch Ken's earlier this week, and obviously their attempts to summarise the two papers that were published, I think, a few days before the elections to the Scottish Parliament and Welsh Senate. I mean, I think we've tried in terms of Wales to synthesise a range of cash evidence over the last 3.5 years, and to link that into 6 main themes. And those were themes, I think, that came out from the early work of CIH, but also from the work that the Knowledge Exchange Hub in Wales did. And 2 of the panellists for the second part are on the Wales Hub. So they helped to sort of shape the research program. So we've set it in the context of the work that CIH did across the UK initially in identifying 6 main themes. As I say, we've selected a smaller number of themes than Ken and Gareth have for Scotland. I think there is some overlap, and I think probably Ken and Gareth have been more ambitious in that they've drawn in some ongoing CIH research, not yet published, which we've referred to in passing, but perhaps should have referred to more fully, on things like retrofit, which is clearly going to be a big challenge for both governments over, well, not just the next 5 years, but the next 15 to 20 years, and also the work on the existing housing stock. So I think there are some differences in the approach that we've taken. There's some, let's say, comparison, some similarities between some of the key areas from the Wales and the Scotland paper, but also some differences. So we've tried to draw out issues around tenant engagement and the links between housing and health, which I think perhaps don't come out quite so strongly from the Scotland paper. In part, I think they come out in the Wales paper because some of the specific work was focused on Wales, so that's probably the reason that it has. But there are overlaps in terms of affordable housing supply, sustainable places, homelessness obviously is a key priority, and the private rented sector. So yeah, I think it'll be hopefully an interesting opportunity to discuss the differences and the similarities. But as I say, the approaches have been different, and so perhaps with hindsight, we might have been a bit more ambitious in Wales. I think the other thing that I'd say is that we envy the fact that Scotland has published the Housing to 2040 paper. We looked at the broad paper in a hub meeting before the pandemic, about 18 months, 2 years ago. And obviously now we've seen the route map. And I think that's probably been very helpful for Ken and Gareth in shaping their priorities. And I'll be interested from other views from other panellists and from other participants about the extent to which Wales needs to think longer term, perhaps just than the 5 years of a single administration.
Thank you, Bob. Ken, a similar question to you. Were the things from the discussion that Pete had done on the video, and Bob said that you would have incorporated, although I think, as Bob noted, you had a slightly wider agenda to start with.
Yes, thanks, Duncan, and thanks, Bob. Yes, I mean, I suppose our paper does 3 or 4 types of things, really. First of all, it's an opportunity to talk about housing policy and housing policy reform at a critical juncture, an election in Scotland, and also one in which COVID, as you said in the introduction, sort of looms large in everything, COVID's recovery and the pandemic lockdown and housing, which is unavoidable. I think also people who have read either or both reviews will recognise that it's a bit of a showcase as well for a range of housing research that's been carried out. And I think there's a device here where we're saying these are generically important issues. Here's some evidence that either we or other parties have assembled, and here are some of the policy prescriptions that we think are at least worth discussing further. So we've got 10 proposals, 9 of which I think fall into that category. The one that doesn't is this notion of end-to-end evidence that we just think is a matter of principle, and kind of in our founding remit in CIH, we think that rigorous evidence from appraisal through monitoring to evaluation is just something that should be at the heart of policy, and it has all sorts of ramifications for the way things like housing planning is done and interventions are conceived. But I quite agree with Bob that there are things that we don't include, and other people talking to us since the reports have been published have identified things that haven't been included, and maybe they should. They're either a pet project or they're a real priority, and there's a perfectly valid case for them to be there. And my one defence, which probably isn't a completely consistent defence, having just listened to what Bob's just said, is that there are some things that we didn't feel we had evidence about, I suppose, directly. But secondly, we have got a new agenda of work that we're about to start. And I won't talk about it just now, but maybe later on in the conversation, I can talk about some of the 7 or 8 new project ideas that we've got.
I'll come back to you later on, Ken, and ask you a question about end-to-end evidence. I'm deeply skeptical about its realistic implementation, but so I'm just giving you a heads up. I'll come back and ask you about that. I wondered, in the Scottish context, the Scottish Government have been very firm on their targets and indeed on general policy rhetoric about decarbonisation and energy retrofit and housing playing in very, very big, both at the Scottish Government level and the major metropolitan level. In Wales, the kind of well-being framework is somewhat better developed. I just wonder if we have absolute targets for carbon reduction, but no absolute target for poverty reduction, will we skew a lot of housing policy expenditures to environment? Then I'm not for a moment doubting the importance of the environmental agenda, but are we going to distort the way we select our priorities? And I'd put that to Ken and then to Bob.
Yeah, well, I think there clearly, in a sense, what you're saying is that these things are deeply integrated and enmeshed together, and I'm sure that's right. One of the common refrains, which again I think is quite right, from the social housing sector in Scotland is the concern about the affordability of the kinds of improvements in properties that will be required, and you know, the sense that may end up trading off to an extent rental affordability for reducing fuel poverty, and that's not necessarily going to leave people in poverty in a much better position. It's obviously not the only reason we're doing this, but surely we don't want to trade off environmental goals for poverty goals. Surely environmental justice is supposed to be in part about poverty alleviation, I guess. So I think yes, I would agree that we have really ambitious goals in mind. The Housing to 2040 talks about the cost to the economy of being around 33 billion. That's kind of today's cost, without really having developed all the mechanisms and the projects and the policies that are actually going to deliver these things. So it's a very difficult number to say is robust or not. I would have thought you would expect it to be probably higher than that over the period. That's a huge resource and a huge commitment, and is deeply challenging. And we don't know what proportions are public and private in that, of course.
Well, I mean, the importance of having targets and standards and so on, I approve entirely. But if there's an asymmetry in the importance within government, then we might see programs a little unbalanced. Bob, is that a concern that you would share, or am I just being too dramatic about it?
No, I think that's absolutely right, Duncan. I mean, obviously in Wales we've had the Framework Wellbeing of Future Generations Act that was passed by the Welsh Government in 2015, and within that, obviously, there's a number of wellbeing goals which talk about, you know, a healthier Wales and a more equal Wales, as well as, you know, tackling broader issues. Since the election, I mean, we've had a Minister for Climate Change, Julie James, with a new title that incorporates the housing portfolio. And we had back in 2019, I think, the 2 major reviews, one of affordable housing supply and one by Chris Joffe of the potential costs of decarbonising the existing housing stock. And there are real tensions, I think, as to where the money is going to come from. We've got a very small initial pilot program in Wales on looking at the sort of the optimal retrofit program, which I think is a program of about 1,300 properties. But again, the figures are enormous in terms of, well, I think Chris Joffe's report suggested for the social sector alone in Wales, it was something in excess of £500 million per annum just to address those. So, yeah, I think, you know, we're going to have to think about where is the money going to come from, and a lot of the money, I guess, is not going to come from the public purse.
Well, I guess that's true. I mean, in terms of the scale of the programme that Ken's talking about in Scotland, it's quite reminiscent of below tolerable standard housing, not defined in energy terms, but in absence of toilets and so on. I think about 1974, there was about roughly 100,000, many were demolished, but that became the centrepiece. Removing that target became the centrepiece of the action, largely of the non-profit sector of housing associations. So big programs run over time. The optimistic thing is big programs, well conceived, run over time, can impact. But also I think that program impacted so many other things. That's partly the point I'm making. How do we make sure it also bring these other points in? And you both set out the agendas and the evidence as, in a sense, defined by what Cash had done. But inconveniently, governments don't necessarily talk about the issues in the same boxes or frameworks as researchers and policy researchers do. And there's been much discussion in the Scottish context of community wealth building, which is focused almost entirely, and correct me anyone in the audience if I'm wrong, on skills and unemployment, and very little about housing assets. In fact, housing assets and non-profits are really important potential anchor institutions for community wealth building, but also the notion of a 15, 20-minute neighbourhood. Both of these are in the Scottish Government's policy programme. Both have got central housing components, I think, that need to be much better articulated. And I just wonder, in the context in Scotland, Ken, are people picking up the things you're saying, but in a sense doing the crossover into what policymakers are actually talking about? And is there a similar problem in Wales, or a similar issue in Wales, Bob? So, Ken.
Well, I think there's definitely you can go so far in talking about housing systems and futures and anticipatory governance, but you run up against, you know, sensible political constraints and electoral cycles and such like. But yeah, I mean, I listening to you, I was thinking how a key kind of triangulation here is, for instance, trying to use community housing associations, say in Glasgow, which are, you know, disproportionately have tenemental stock at their core, which is clearly linked to retrofit and conservation issues and heritage issues and things like that. But also a fact that the life cycle of those buildings is now quite a long time since a lot of them were improved, and you know, there's an issue about the next stage and the next phase. So increasingly, and this is certainly the case in the programme of work that we're doing with Southside Housing Association and the tenement retrofit, is that simultaneously they've acquired tenemental stock from a private landlord. It needs to be improved, full stop. But in addition to that, we're adding the green retrofit onto the top of it. And I think a lot of housing associations will confront that. So their capacity to do things is going to be materially affected by the kind of environment that we're propelling them into, which is to some extent is fair enough, but it does constrain the choices of things that they can do. So for instance, their ability to be that community anchor further develop some of these concepts about very, you know, amenity-rich neighbourhoods, being able to move around, etc. There are going to be constraints imposed on them because of the stock they have and because of the other requirements that policy is putting on them. And although we agree with all of those things individually, the combination of them could be quite challenging. Very interesting in Housing to 2040 that it talks about the need to pursue tenement law reform now in order to. I think a lot of that's to do with private owners and retrofit and those sorts of issues. But that seems to be really important, and there was great work that Douglas Robertson did a couple of years back for the parliamentary working group on that. It's really important things, I think, to actually provide the enable these kind of things to make progress.
Bob, have you got?
Yeah, just following on from what Ken's saying. I mean, I think we'll admit that there are some significant gaps, and no doubt others will explore those during the course of the afternoon in what we've outlined in the way. And I think there's been work going on in Wales, for example, around housing and the foundational economy. So colleagues in Cardiff in the Wales Institute for Social and Economic Research and Data have been doing work on the role that housing, and particularly sort of housing associations, might play in the foundational economy, working with economists at Manchester who you probably know better than I do. So I think there is work going on there, but I suppose because it's been outside of the remit of cash, it's not something we've considered in our paper on Wales. I mean, and it comes back to the sort of the information that we may need. In Wales, we've had almost a 20-year programme to achieve the Welsh Housing Quality Standard, which I think was originally set out as a 5-year programme, and it's taken 20. And I think we're probably more or less there. There may be one or two local authorities that haven't quite hit that target as yet, but it's taken 20 years. I'm not convinced, maybe it wouldn't have been any quicker or any better had it been the case, but I'm not convinced that we were actually clear at the outset of that programme that we knew what the targets and milestones and what we were trying to achieve in policy terms when the programme was outlined. So, it was a very well-meaning programme, and it's obviously levered a lot of investment into improving the quality of the social housing stock in Wales, but it has taken a long time, and I'm not absolutely clear that we can measure the true impacts of it in terms of jobs or health or whatever, as well as the benefits in terms of the improvement of the housing stock.
One of the things that I was quite impressed by in the 2040 document in the Scottish context was the recognition that to address many of the issues in the affordable sector, we actually have to get the housing market under control in terms of rising real house prices. And I think that that's been a really critical issue that's been de-emphasized in British housing policy generally for the last 50 years, literally. And whether or not you see it as a matter of national fiscal policy, taxation of wealth, or monetary policy, it's all these things, but it's also about organising the supply side. And by that, I don't just mean issues about planning, there's issues about labour, about materials, and so on. In the comments that came from both Wales and Scotland, I didn't see anything that was saying, here's a better way to organise the housing market, or here are the policy measures over the next 5 years that will actually begin to, we don't just want zero carbon, we want zero house price inflation would be my target, if you like. So how do we go forward? If we don't fix the elephant in the economy, so to speak, how do we fix the housing system?
I'll maybe say a little bit about what we did say. I think this kind of starts with the principal statement of Housing to 2040, which is this really ambitious, talk about definancializing housing, or despeculating housing, perhaps, and trying to think of housing as a affordable consumption quality issue, and actually explicitly seeks to stabilize house prices, and that private landlords shouldn't expect to make capital gain returns. Now, that only means exactly what you've said. It seems to me that the end game is stable real house prices, but the actual ambition that's shown in Housing to 2040 is very, very modest. I mean, it talks about a housing taxation review during the Parliament. So we suggested that part of this seems to be about laying the ground for a conversation which allows policy to almost enable some of the steps that need to be taken, and that's about moving away from the mystical status of home ownership, I suppose, to some extent. It's also about finding alternatives for people to earn returns which are hard at the moment, because it's very hard to earn the kind of returns that people seem to earn from the housing market, and which takes us on to the Tony Atkinson argument about a national savings system which generates real rates of return to diversify people's savings and investments. But that somewhere in the future, hopefully sooner rather than later, we need to readjust housing taxation. And clearly in Scotland or in Wales's case, it's what you've got the powers over and what you haven't got powers over. But certainly in Scotland, it seems to me that if there was the will, there's a lot that can be done.
Well,
I don't think there's a great deal I want to add on that. Obviously, we focus very much upon the social part of the housing system within the Wales paper, but clearly, there are enormous pressures on different housing markets in Wales. Again, one of the issues that we haven't highlighted, but clearly is an issue in the Welsh context, is the issue of second ownership and empty housing and whatever, and the impacts that they have upon house prices and affordability within particular parts of Wales, within mid Wales, in some of the north and west, and in places like Monmouthshire or whatever. So again, I think probably there is more work that needs to be done in Wales to get a better understanding of local housing markets. I think for me, that's also an issue about, well, the extent to which there are the skills existing within the sort of strategic housing function and the planning function to do that sort of level of analysis of changing housing markets. And again, there's been some good work done in Wales, but quite a long time ago, I think, and it's very patchy, is my impression.
Thanks, Bob. My general sense in both would expect this, because my particular interest is in the economy and housing. I don't think the case for housing policy and its impact on the economy gets well made at any of the scales we need to think of. I think it's much more important in the economy in all kinds of ways than we figure. I think it's much more important for the economy in terms of a whole set of spillover effects, a whole range of things. And at the national scale in Scotland particularly, there's never been a coherent conversation outside these circles, if you like, about housing in the economy. And I just wonder, as an example of that, whether or not one is in favour of rent controls of various different kinds. I don't think I've seen a single estimate of the potential supply effects of the kinds of controls that are being proposed. Now, given that housing supply is one of the key problems, if I was a policymaker, I'd want to know, well, what's the additional supply we're going to have to make up by other means. And I just wonder, Ken, you were talking about evaluating policies from end to end. I think policy's got quite a long way to go on that front.
Yeah, and we've been, one of the bits of work that hasn't been published yet is an evidence view on rent controls, which is interesting for all sorts of reasons. I mean, I think it suggests that we have a problem in the UK, is that we don't really have any evidence since the late 1980s, which we could draw on. So any kind of assessment is going to be quite a remote kind of exercise, which is doing a hypothetical examination if you made some kind of intervention in the private rental market, and quite hard to assess just how credible that would be. My reading of that literature is that it's really important that we understand the impact of rent controls in the context of how competitive specific metropolitan or urban housing markets actually are, and how competitive rental markets were. The single most impressive piece of work I saw on that was by Steve Malpetzi and Bengt Turner in 2003. And one of the things that they really make a case for at an international scale is actually trying to give a reasoned estimate of how competitive actual markets are. There's just an assumption made about it in most econometric studies, but we know if the market's less competitive, the standard kind of economic analysis of rent controls doesn't follow through in the same way. On the other hand, what's being talked about in Scotland is some as yet unknown revision of the rent pressure zones, which is a very mild form of rent stabilisation. It fell down on a number of grounds and was never implemented, of course. So it's really not clear just how far and what that's going to look like, but they absolutely should be looking hard at the evidence from Ireland, from continental Europe, from the United States, but they should be wary of just making too big a read across from it. I know that only answers part of what you asked, Duncan, but I hope it's useful.
I'm going to ask you for a last comment because I want to bring in our panelists. But before we do that, we've had one question put in question and answers from Mike Wilson. And just for brevity, rather than unwillingness to see you, Mike, but just for brevity, Mike's question is, to what extent has there been a recognition that, at least in Scotland, there's now something of a culture of hitting target numbers, mainly about affordable housing provision, while making what seems to be a completely erroneous assumption that new affordable housing somehow magically creates a sense of community? In other words, do we assume too much about what new housing investment will do in terms of creating community? So Bob, and then Ken, and then we'll come to the panel.
Yeah, well, certainly Wales has had its targets. So the last Labour government had the 20,000 target for affordable homes, of which I think about 13,500 were meant to be affordable social rented homes. That target was achieved, and indeed I think targets set for the previous administrations have been achieved. So yeah, that there has been, I think, occasionally an overemphasis on setting targets. The new government, I think, has indicated a floor rather than a target, and has talked about 20,000 social rented homes as a minimum for the period. Yeah, I think probably there is more that needs to be done in terms of thinking about how housing policy contributes to the well-being of communities, and that I think is about tackling broader issues of poverty and inequality and discrimination and lots of other broader issues, which I think comes back to the issue that I think Ken Gareth draw out very strongly in the Scottish paper, and we've touched on in the Welsh paper, is about the need for thinking about housing in systems thinking terms, and thinking about its links into social policy, economics, environmental policy, and whatever, and also in terms of thinking about the planning of sustainable neighbourhoods, some broader issues. So part of it is about having that broader vision, I think, that goes beyond targets for 5-year administrations. Okay,
thanks very much, Bob. Ken?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's quite fashionable to start from the presumption that having numerical targets may mean less good outcomes in some respect, because there's less of a focus, there's less of a emphasis on what's actually being constructed. So I think it's an empirical question that we have to look at specific developments to see kind of what they're actually doing, and seeing to what extent they are integrated and that they are carefully thought through. I'm sure in many cases that's exactly what they are. We've certainly had a galvanizing effect with the last two parliaments' supply programs. A lot of good things have come out of them. A lot of new models have come out of them, which I think are very interesting. I'm thinking of some of the affordable models as opposed to the social housing, but it brings with itself problems. And you know, going back to what we were talking about earlier, the supply program on the social side going forward is going to have to also address the targets, the higher standards attached to green housing build, which will be challenging. So it's like many of these questions, it's not straightforward. I mean, the other thing I would say, I suppose, is that we have different views about how accurate these measures of housing need are in the aggregate, but there's a kind of conventional judgment and acceptance of the kind of aggregate needs studies, both by government and by the main kind of lobbies, etc. And they all go back to the originally to the Glenn Bramley type models. There was a number for the last Parliament. There's a number for the current Parliament just begun, and Scottish Government said they're going to build the same target for 10 years, but literally there is no evidence for the second Parliament. I don't imagine that need is going to fall to zero, but I do think there remains an ongoing case to try and link what's being done to levels of need, and particularly at local scale. So how we think about housing planning at the local metropolitan scale, etc., is really important, particularly now that the government has kind of got a national planning framework which sits above all of that. So these things are intrinsically linked together, but I wouldn't automatically assume that the outcomes are necessarily going to be less than what we would want. I guess it will vary.
Thanks, Ken. That's a very reasonable argument. I'm actually publishing a report about Scotland's places on Monday or Tuesday next week, can't remember which day at this point, in which I agree with Craig Sanderson that the Scottish Government should be doubling the affordable housing programme. But then again, that wasn't necessarily an evidence-based comment. So thank you for the very reasoned cases that you've made. For more reasoned cases, I'm going to move on to Ashley Campbell and Matt Dix, because they have to deal with not only a complicated set of housing policy things, they have to deal with all these complicated housing researchers as well. So, Matt, I wonder, from the discussion that we've had and the videos, or even just your sense of what's important, what are the key issues we should be focusing on here? What are the key things over the next 5 years?
Well, just following on from the discussion there, for me, sort of, Bob summed it up towards the end there in terms of bringing that systems thinking approach to how we approach housing. And, in terms of what the Welsh Government has done since May the 6th in creating this sort of super ministry, if you like, this climate change ministry, which is the first time it's been done in the UK, brings housing into that process. But however, my understanding has been a bit of a bun fight around what goes into that ministry. So you have housing there, you have homelessness there, but in the same breath you have things like fuel poverty sitting in other ministerial portfolios, social justice, and sort of welfare issues as well. So still waiting to understand what the detail on the bone's going to be in terms of where housing sits. But it goes back to a point that you Duncan were making, and Ken, about the targets of building decarb homes, etc. But then we don't have targets about reducing poverty. So whether there's a move to sort of seeing housing as the vehicle through which to decarb and that side of things, and green build out and green economy, and that's the focus of government across the UK. And less about a mechanism through which to tackle social injustice and poverty. So I think we're still waiting to see how that works out. And the other thing that I think was very, very pertinent was Ken was talking about addressing the housing market and trying to sort of close that stable, get the pause back in and close that stable door around decapitalising the housing market and how we do that. And I suppose from a Welsh perspective, there's not many levers open to the Welsh Government. I think one of the big elephants in the room there is around land supply and cost of land, and how we try and capture land value. So vacant land tax is back on the agenda. I see Generic was talking about it last week as one way, but that can have an adverse effect on land prices and development and build out, etc. So and you know, what other options are open to the Welsh Government in taxation on that? So you know, very real issues about land supply. But I think, you know, also in that question and discussion is the importance of health and how we link housing into the health discussion, public health. You know, the pandemic, if nothing else, has been a story of public health, and housing is a key part of public health. So how, you know, we all know that health and, you know, reducing waiting lists and spend on health is going to be, you know, a top priority, along with social care for all governments. And that's where all the sort of big budget spend is probably going to go, along with climate change and economic development. So how do we see housing into that thinking? And that comes back to the original point about housing as the wider systems thinking approach.
Thanks. I think that's very thoughtful comments. And Ashley?
Thanks, Duncan. I think we're in quite a lucky position in Scotland, in that there at least appears to be political will to invest in housing and to invest in changes for the better. We've got the new Housing to 2040 strategy that we've talked about already with Ken and Bob. And I think a key thread that needs to run through everything, while there are quite a lot of competing priorities, is affordability. So we are asking local authorities and RSLs to continue investing in new supply. At the same time, we want them to invest in improving the quality of existing homes. We're looking for, you know, changes in regulations, greater pressure on local authorities to enforce different regulations in the private rented sector, looking at short-term lets, looking at energy efficiency and climate change. And I think that we need to keep sight of affordability through this. Where are we getting the resources to ensure that we have enough funds going in to make sure that the homes that we're building are affordable? And I think we mentioned earlier as well that tension between investing in energy efficiency and meeting climate change targets, but we also have statutory fuel poverty targets in Scotland as well. So how do we make sure that the investment doesn't start to kind of lose the balance with affordability? And I think the other key area for me as well, Matt just mentioned, is that relationship and the partnership between housing and health and social care. I think that was maybe a key point that was missing or overlooked in the Scotland paper. It was mentioned just at the end in relation to proposals for a new prevention duty for other public bodies to have a duty to prevent homelessness in Scotland. And I think that would be really helpful, not least in the fact that it reinforces the fact that homelessness is not just a housing issue. Somebody losing their home and becoming homeless has been on a journey, often a very complex journey, and housing needs health to be part of the solution to that, not just a prevention agenda, but also in supporting people who do become homeless, as we're seeing scaling up and rolling out of Housing First in Scotland, which is really, really positive. But where is the long-term funding coming? Where do we have the guarantee that the support for the people going through Housing First is going to be there next year, the year after, in 5 or 10 years' time? And I think as well as in relation to homelessness, we need a better links between housing and health throughout somebody's housing journey. So we know that investing in adaptations, for example, can prevent trips and falls, that can prevent people being admitted to hospital or into residential care, which is very, very costly for the NHS. Yet the funding for adaptations has remained static for the last 7 or 8 years. So how do we rebalance funding into prevention work, where investing in housing is saving money for health and social care, or saving money for the criminal justice system in terms of people who are perhaps leaving prison with nowhere to go on that first night? They are reoffending and ending up back in the system. So I think we need to look at where we can make better links across different departments and across different organisations, and that will be really, really important to achieving all of these different policy areas.
Thank you, Ashley. And Matt, as I was saying earlier, I do a lot of my housing research in Australia, and I also live half my time in, or under half my time in Canada. And I deal with the equivalent of provincial and state governments, which would be like dealing with Scotland and Wales in these terms of levels of resource and so on. And I'd have to say that both Scotland and Wales are much more committed to having any coherent housing strategy than the other domains that I work in. And I think that's also true in relation to some areas of England, but not all. So we have the advantage of governments that are interested and polities that seem to think that housing is still important. But when we get to it, I think there's often a very hard reality in housing that I did a study a long time ago for OECD looking at housing subsidies in Europe. If you want to help the poorest 20% of a population to attain decent level housing in that particular society, every piece of work we did suggested you had to subsidise it to the extent of 65 to 70% of the cost, whether you did it by interest loans, whether you did it by housing allowances, or whether you did it by upfront capital grants. And I think getting governments, both in Scotland and Wales, where they're articulating levels of programmes, it's really important to get, some sense of just how much money, your point, Ashley, is needed to keep people in the flow. And I just wondered, do you get that sense in Wales, Matt, that government actually thinks through that issue?
Well, that's a $64,000 question, isn't it? None of us would disagree in Wales in the sector with the government's ambition around, the 20,000 target for social housing units in the next 5 years, or its ambition to support, supported housing grant, etc. But it's that Jerry Maguire moment, isn't it? Show me the money then, because the sums at the moment, if you're talking about the 20,000 ambition, that's what, 4,000 units per annum to reach that 20,000 target. We've got RSLs building around 2,500 at the moment. We've got councils building about 600, although pipelines suggesting that by 23, 24, that's 1,500 a year. So that's what, almost up to the 4,000. But in order to build those, you're looking at, social housing grant at the current 58% intervention rates, of around 330 million per year. That's based on all those 4,000 being social rented units. Currently we got up to 250 million around that in the last year of the previous parliamentary term, which was a record investment, and you can't criticise the government for that. So we're not there in terms of investment, and that's before we even start talking about the sort of support service in the support housing grant, etc. That needs to be brought in to support people once they're into those tenancies. Although again, the Welsh Government has been more committed than perhaps others have, but it's interesting that, at the height of austerity, that commitment to social support housing grant wasn't quite there. They were talking about merging it with other sort of support grant streams. So it's a case of supporting the narrative, but we need to see, that longer term commitment to funding that Ashley was talking about, and we haven't quite got that yet, and I'm not sure we can get that given the current climate and what the fiscal landscape will look like. And then you put the elephant in the room of health. In Wales, 55% is currently spent on the health budget from the block grant. Welsh Government Centre was saying that was going to go up to about 60% by this year, and that was prior to COVID. So with waiting lists up to 500,000 from around 20,000, then the pull on the sort of block grant is going to be greater and greater. And like I was saying earlier, how do we fit the housing agenda into that? And which is why I asked the question about whether the emphasis is around that economic development side and that green build out rather than the sort of social minded side, social justice side.
I'm going to throw a question to Ashley, but it also relates back to Wales. Amanda Oliver has posed a question to the discussants or panelists. What would be a sustainable housing finance system look like for social housing? for example, supported by Housing Services in Wales, funded through Housing Benefit and Housing Revenue Grant, with Housing Benefit administered by the UK government and HRG administered in Wales. In other words, I think that what Amanda is getting at is, are there components in place you could begin to build a better way to deliver the programs and continuities you're talking about? Or is it just a sort of mishmash that is insufficient to the task?
I think maybe going back to the issue that we were talking about earlier about whether it's useful or not to have an ultimate target or a numerical target for delivering new affordable housing. When there's a finite pot of money to deliver that affordable housing, I don't think that a concrete number is particularly helpful. So the Scottish Government just now is looking at subsidy rates and looking at potentially reviewing those subsidy rates for the next affordable housing supply programme over the next 5 years. We don't yet know what those rates are going to look like, so we don't yet know how much grant funding is going to go into new affordable supply. But we do know from research that was carried out by SFHA that they think that the average cost of building a new affordable home in Scotland has increased by between £20,000 and £24,000 over the last 5 years. On top of that, the Scottish Government is looking to the housing sector to be building homes that are more energy efficient, that have greater indoor and outdoor space standards as a result of the pandemic and the way that people are using their homes differently now. They need to be more digitally connected, they need to be more accessible and more adaptable. And all of these things we would absolutely fully support. But we need to make sure that the finance is there and the resources are there to be able to achieve that. In terms of support for people through the welfare system, we know that that's woefully inadequate at a UK government level. The pandemic has shone a light on that, and the fact that a lot of people who may never have had to access the welfare system before suddenly found themselves in a position where they needed support, and they said, wait, is this all you get? This isn't enough to live on. And the UK government responded by adding an extra £20 a week to the universal credit rate. So the government has acknowledged that the welfare system is inadequate, but are they going to let the £20 a week stay, or are they going to claw that back again? I think in terms of the private rented sector as well, research that CIH has conducted has showed that the LHA rates, the housing support for people living in the private rented sector, is inadequate. It's not linked to the actual cost of renting. It's preventing a lot of people from accessing the private rented sector, and that's having impacts in Scotland on things like local authorities' rapid rehousing transition plans. Local authorities are telling us that they would like to be able to see the private rented sector as a viable option for people. We don't have enough supply of social housing to support people who are becoming homeless, but people are prevented from accessing the private rented sector because of affordability. Young people in particular are subject to the shared accommodation rate. I think that needs to be reviewed urgently. So I think, yeah, there are a lot of different elements all working together, and they all need to be looked at in the round to make sure that housing is affordable, whether you're renting privately, whether you're renting in the social rented sector, whether you're in low paid employment, or whether you're getting help through the welfare system.
It's actually, I mean, I take from what both of you have said and the questions that, you know, that we have governments in Wales and Scotland with good intentions here and some good ideas, but there's a fuzziness, and there's a fuzziness about the cash, about how we move toward, I don't mean cash the organisation, I mean cash the money. There's a fuzziness about what we do actually manage to achieve in 5 years. And it's back to my point, why we drive down on, and correctly, on the carbon target, what are we doing to drive down on the homelessness target? What are we driving down on the proportion of people paying more than 30% of their income for rent, et cetera, et cetera. So I don't want to be too pessimistic, but I've gotten sufficiently old and cranky now that the kind of rhetoric speak of just optimism without money doesn't cut it for me anymore in policy discussions. So I think you've kind of reinforced my view that we need to do a lot more. Matt, a last comment from you on this, and then I'm going to turn to David and Tamsin and talk a bit about the supply side, and we'll come back and talk about the issues together. Matt, did you want to?
Yeah, I think I'm old and cranky well before my time, Duncan. So I feel the same pain. I think the problem is we're trying to understand that financing side and investment side in the context of the current housing system, aren't we? So I mean, you could bring welfare powers to Wales, but actually, well, what's the Welsh government going to be able to do differently? Because the problem is that LHA rate or the market rent in many areas is outstripping LHA rate, and that's going to keep going up unless we address the housing market that in the way that Ken was talking about earlier, and try and take the heat out of that. And then we come back to, well, how do we do that? And it's about do we do it through land value capture and trying to keep land prices down, etc., or do we do it through other mechanisms? So I come back to that original point, that I was talking about at the beginning, and that Bob mentions. It's that systems thinking, and how do we join that all up, about housing in terms of health, housing in terms of economic development and green recovery, housing in terms of addressing poverty and social injustice. And whilst the Welsh government and the Scottish government are making a good attempt at that, and the Welsh government through the Future Generations Act. The problem is that many of these big public behemoths of policy areas, health, education, they're not working together, still operating in a silo approach, and at a very fundamental level. I think that's the issue. And so last parliamentary term we had housing and local government as a ministerial portfolio. Before that we had housing and communities as a portfolio, with planning and local government sitting in another portfolio. So where is housing sitting in that big public policy debate? We all know that health is going to get a large chunk of money always, because it's a universal right. So I will end with that point. We've been campaigning with Shelter Cymru and Tai Pawb for the incorporation of the right to adequate housing fully into Welsh law for 2 years now. 3 of the big parties committed to it in the election just gone. The current Labour minister is committed to it in principle, but the response comes back, well, we haven't got enough supply, or we haven't got enough investment to put into supported housing services such as Housing First, etc., which we feel is a circular argument. And do we need that legislative stick now as a starting point to really drive that progression of housing up the policy ladder? I've just booked onto the cash seminar next month, actually, in terms of the debate in Scotland, because you guys have there was a draft bill, wasn't there, before the election for the incorporation of the social and economic duties, which I know the Welsh government are considering at the moment. So it's a higher debate than that. Do we need that sort of prod of a universal right to move us to the next phase, and almost a paradigm shift in the way housing is viewed in that wider policy context?
I think that's absolutely right, and thank you. I'll come back to you, and I also want to take some questions, and I'm going to bring in Tamsin and David. Just before doing so, Ken and Bob talked about the importance of seeing housing as systems, a view I've espoused for quite a long time myself. The corollary of that is you need governance of systems. And I think that's where housing falls down. You need it at all different levels. I think you actually need institutions at very local levels and non-profits that do more than one function, that can integrate within a neighbourhood and the estate. So the neighbourhood level is important. The city deals have been quite good at illustrating how governance can improve across a set of areas around a big strategic things. But housing's not been part of the process, and certainly communities have not been part of the process of city deals. I sit on the Glasgow Economic Commission, and I'm amazed that communities have been so little involved in the Glasgow City deal. So you can see how you can put governance arrangements that bring sectors together, but also levels of government. But then you have to, my point, go back to think how we re-engineer the relationship between cities and municipalities and Scotland and Wales level. And then after that, I mean, British governance arrangements are shocking compared with, say, Canada and Australia, where federal governments that aren't always friends with state and provinces at least meet them on a fairly regular basis to talk about what they're trying to do. And that has just been frankly missing. So sorry about that, was my second rant of the day, but when we talk about systems, we need the governance of the systems in place too. And that's a less technical issue, and it's a deeply political issue, but that needs to potentially change as well. Moving to, I'm going to say almost camera issues of the supply side, I want to bring David and Tamsin in. Hi, David. Hi, Tamsin. In terms of the discussions that we've had with Matt and Ashley and Ken and Bob, are there particular, David, I'll start with you on this. Are there particular things on the supply side on housing that we can, and land side, that we can look to improve quite quickly? When Ken talks about we can't change the tax system quickly, he's probably right. But we can change a lot about land supply, and that has potentially significant effects on housing prices. And I just wondered, have you had any particular thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think there are, Duncan, and I'm very supportive of the proposals on the Cash Scottish paper about empowering local authorities and resourcing them to pursue active land policies and to bring forward vacant and derelict land and brownfield sites. We've been engaged in a review of land for housing for the last couple of years that we plan to publish next month. I think if there was one message I would put across from that, it's that if you want to deliver more homes in better places and deliver homes in all the places that are needed, you can't rely on the private sector as we do at the moment to absolutely lead on strategic land promotion. So I think a move towards the public sector playing a more active role, as research that we carried out on some European countries found that if you can have the public sector playing a more active role and sharing more of the risk, then that can lead to delivery of housing in places that you don't get at the moment, in rural areas and regeneration areas, but also it hopefully reduces risk for private developers. So you start to get more homes and potentially prices come down. So yeah, for me, if there was a single message, it's for this more muscular role for the public sector.
Yeah. Would you say that was the case also in Wales, Tamsin? Or?
Yeah, I would, Duncan, thank you. We've been having a debate in Wales and some action, it has to be said, around better use of publicly owned land for affordable housing for, gosh, it must be at least a decade, if not more. I was in Welsh Government between 2012 and 2014, and the mechanism then was, if it was a piece of land in the economy minister's portfolio, the finance minister would give money to the housing minister to buy the land from the economy minister. Essentially, I'm using very crude language then. So it was still about the land having a value that had to be paid, and so it sort of happened. That process, that mechanism has supported some additional affordable housing, but it's a bit of a crazy mechanism to use in my mind. So I think it's an issue that really needs some some very clear attention, and to not treat it just like another way of transacting, which is we've seen because I mean at the moment, certainly in Cardiff, the house price inflation is such that you're getting quite large housing developments in the city centre, in a rising house rising market, very rapidly rising market, with the developers still claiming pleading financial viability, so coming through with zero affordable housing. So we're playing a very bizarre game, I think, and if we carry on trying to play to the same rules, it's just, you can have very little impact. So I'm absolutely for those kind of mechanisms that they've been much examined in much more detail in Scotland than they have in Wales, but I think we've collectively got, Health Service has quite a lot of land. There's been some examples, but it's not, we're very poor, I think, in in Wales, and I don't know if it's better in Scotland, at taking we've got lots of pilots, demonstration projects, of exploring how a concept might work. We're really poor at scaling those up to actually, have an impact across the nation. So yeah, I think it's an area that needs a lot of attention.
And I think it's you're right that, and it's also part of the decision-taking framework that accompanied the kind of economics that came to dominate government thinking in the early 1980s. We've abandoned some of these objectives by taking on inclusive growth and zero carbon. Maybe we need to abandon some of the techniques. That's designed to irritate Ken, and he'll come back and tell me I'm wrong. But I think it is. I mean, I've sat in government ministries taking decisions exactly about the problem of somebody trying to get land from the infrastructure department I worked in to build affordable housing, and we charge them full whack for the money. Now, that's not a very good way of delivering affordable housing, nor does it when you've cost-benefit analysis, you put in as a measure of the value and gain from the project the maximum land value. That's not running much in favour of affordable housing. Now I understand why governments do it, but perhaps need to change. We've talked about and kind of about implications to the urban setting. In the rural context of towns and rural areas in Scotland, I think there has been a lot of progress on community land transfers. Now, we had a question in from Emily Robertson, who was saying community land trusts in Wales have found it difficult to source funding to build affordable and regenerative housing because in Wales there's not an equivalent to England's community housing fund. Do you want to comment on that, Tamsin, about how the absence of that is really important in rural areas and maybe even smaller towns, I suspect now. And then maybe I'll ask Dave to comment on the Scottish experience. So, Tamsin.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, the community land trusts, various more cooperative models of housing are really, really important in terms, ownership matters, doesn't it? And if community ownership of land can take some of the sting out of the way things work currently, I think that's really, as well as all the other benefits that come. There's evidence for other benefits coming from those models, and I think it's a really good example. I mean, good in inverted commas example in Wales of where there's lots of positive words, but then when it actually comes to the fundamental mechanisms that enable communities to do stuff, those things haven't been addressed. So there's a commitment and there's some nice words, but actually the hard-nosed, whether it's money or the other policy, levers that need to be there to make sure that can happen for communities. And it is so vital, isn't it, for smaller communities, whether they be towns or villages in rural areas, that local people can actually stay in those communities and keep the communities alive. And it's we all know the narrative around that. So I think it's some of the conversation earlier, wasn't it? Was about when evidence hits the buffers of money. I think there's when evidence hits the buffers of kind of the rhetoric and reality of the political sphere as well. And I think you can get lots of kind of vigorous nods from politicians about something. You think they've got it, but I don't. It's quite often my experience has been they've got it in at one level, they haven't really got it in terms of, so if we are going to commit to this means the following actions need to be taken. And maybe as folk in the policy sphere, and I know this happens quite a lot, but we need to spell that out more clearly, I feel, because otherwise we are left with people, who put a lot of work, like the group, the questioners involved in, who put a lot of effort and time in themselves, and then just hit those buffers, and it must feel extraordinarily frustrating when the words are saying the right things. Yeah,
I'm reminded in this conversation that the last housing minister in Scotland before devolution, Callum MacDonald, who came from the Western Isles, used to have a slogan that he wanted community ownership for the peripheral estates. In the cities, for the peripheral estates, community ownership of housing, and in peripheral Scotland, he wanted community ownership of land. And David, we've maintained interest in at least one of these things, and I just wonder if you think that community ownership of land has been important in delivering housing solutions in rural Scotland, and whether or not it could play a role in towns as well.
Yeah, thanks, Duncan. I think it has been very important. And going back to my point earlier, the large speculative developers don't deliver in rural areas. It then becomes important that other alternative tenures actually provide housing, and community-owned land and community-led housing has been quite successful over the last few years, and it has to be said it's been helped by the Scottish Land Fund and the Rural and Island Housing Fund. But I think there's a role, particularly after the pandemic, and towns and city centres, there's potential for community-led housing to then maybe fulfill a gap and provide an alternative to either housing for sale. It's maybe larger homes, more in greenfield sites, but it's a different tenure to social housing. So the Mid-Steeple Quarter project in Dumfries is very interesting. And going back to the point I made about public sector capacity, that there's a role for more capacity and skills that could actually help with these projects, because otherwise, even with the funding, I'm similar as Tamsin was saying about Wales, sometimes you're asking community organisations to do an awful lot of work, and we know that developing housing is very complex and time consuming.
Well, I agree. And about in Scotland, we often forget that the average size of a local authority, and I'm not talking about the urban ones, is 70,000 people. But we're talking about communities. In the European context, we're often talking about much smaller local authorities who are closer to these communities. So I think that on housing and other things, community entities are important. However, because of freeze on local government budgets, and that's been very apparent in Scotland for the last 12 years, everything apart from statutory services get cut down, and the additional, and any resources about capital to implement change disappeared pretty much when we abolished regions in Scotland 20 odd years ago. So the capacity to do these things is really limited. And I do think that is something that Scottish Government should think about, is whether or not, for the period particularly of the decarbonisation of housing, it needs to put in place some kind of agency that actually does work with local communities and boosts local community capacities. We had that in housing, we stretched it out and then we abandoned it. And I'm not sure that that was necessarily the right thing. There are very few people in Scotland that will ever say that, but since I was on the board of the relevant agency, I still say it. Sorry, I'm saying too much there. So on the supply side, there are things that we can do that can improve things, both at quite large scale in metropolitan areas, but also in pockets within in the rural, that matter, in the rural community. So that's suggesting that we should be slightly positive and be asking government to direct a lot of attention to the supply side. I don't buy into the role that planners are the be-all and end-all of all problems in the housing system. I don't believe that. And sometimes there's too little planning rather than too much. But that's positive. I just wonder if Ashley and Matt, if you've got any take on that, because you're dealing with supply and other issues. Do you think there should be a bigger emphasis on supply side change?
Yeah, it goes back to the sort of point I was making earlier. You know, the ambition is there from Welsh Government, but it's having to operate within the system we've got. But you know, you could look at various things. You know, in terms of the recommendations that came from the affordable housing supply review a couple of years ago, a lot of that has been implemented or in the process of being implemented. One of the key recommendations back to land again was an arm's length, and this is what Tamsin was kind of alluding to, an arm's length body, to look after public land, for development, etc., and particularly around housing. Now, the government has responded to that. They've set up a department in Welsh Government, but it's not arm's length. So I'm just wondering whether you need that sort of distance from government to really make a difference in terms of understanding the wider value of land in terms of community and cost benefit, etc. So I think there's a lot more to be done. And when you look at who's building at pace and scale, so I mentioned earlier how many units the RSLs and local authorities were building. So still the sort of volume and SME builders are building a large chunk of the number of units. So how do we involve them in the supply of social and affordable housing? Now, I know one thing the government are looking at a way of doing that is through standards and space standards. And is that something we can look at? It's about sort of unifying space standards, bringing the private developers with us, so that you're creating a unified home in Wales that local authorities could buy off the shelf, if you like, and you're really there sort of creating cross tenure communities as well, because they can buy several different several units in a bigger development, but that's about bringing volume builders and SME builders along with us. And how do we incentivize that? And they're talking about pegging that unified standard to help to buy, for example. So there's a lot more that can be explored. Land being one of the biggest barriers and most costly barriers. So I think that probably needs to be more focus on that.
There's a couple of questions come in or comments from people saying that this is a real problem, but in a way we can't keep doing business the way we do business now. The plan, I think, from a proactive housing policy point of view, the planning system and the housing system, that our hands are tied behind our backs in terms of taking things forward. But Mark Harris and Catherine Wood have made the point that moving towards more housing delivered by the public sector is extraordinarily difficult, just because of the shortage of resources within local authorities to do this, and that's human resources as well as capital. And Catherine's making the point that, again, local authorities don't have the resources nor expertise in finance to deliver directly more affordable housing. And the expectation is public land is sold on the open market for a premium value. Well, I think, in a sense, what we're saying that kind of view has to change. So there's either a different relationship between government and the private sector, or alternatively, other voices have to come into the supply side. And I just wondered, David, what you thought of that in the Scottish context.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a really good point that the two questioners make in their comments. But, as you alluded to there, I don't think we can go on as we are. And it's been talked earlier that Scotland's got very ambitious, carbon reduction targets. But at the moment, our model of delivering most housing for sale, 50% or more is built on greenfield sites. And we've still got a huge legacy of vacant and derelict land. We could have more of that with changes post-COVID to town centres, shopping and offices. So I don't dispute that public bodies lack the resources and skills at the moment. I think it's likely that one of our recommendations will be that there needs to be an increase in resources and skills and capacity to do this kind of strategic land promotion. And a final point on that, I wasn't necessarily talking about councils building and owning the homes themselves. It's about them being much more strategic bodies and, I suppose, being more active rather than waiting to see what land promoters and developers bring forward as sites for housing. It's them doing the housing needs and demand assessment, having the sort of housing system approach and saying, this is where we think the best places for development are.
Thank you, Dave. One of the points that Catherine had also made was that Hondas don't necessarily describe local market context very well, and I would agree with that, I have to say. But in a sense, completing the coverage on these points about land and thinking about how we push this harder so that we facilitate the development of supply. Tamsin, do you think there are other things we need? And I'm going to ask Ashley the same. Are there other things we should be thinking about and making governments think about just now?
I think it's an overall narrative which has been really clearly expressed by others, isn't it? In that if we carry on with the system we've got, you can get improvements, but are they going to be more than at the margins? So I think again, it's the reality of delivering targets that you've set, government, and what's that going to mean in practice if we're not just going to do it against the background of increasingly unaffordable housing in the market, whether that be rented or owned. So there's a kind of reality check kind of narrative, some conversations that need to go on. Just wanted to pick up the housing needs assessment issue. I mean, I found it really, I was on the homelessness advisory group that the Welsh Government Minister with responsibility for housing, Julie Jones, set up a while ago, similar to the HARSAG group in Scotland. So looking at making recommendations on how we might end homelessness in Wales. And one of the things we talked about there was about how the housing needs assessment doesn't, which seems a bit crazy when you think about it, but they really don't pick up, the sort of homelessness is here and housing needs assessments are there, so they don't necessarily, and particularly thinking of it in the context of rapid rehousing transition plans, which will come to us in Wales. We're not as far forward developed with that as Scotland is the two to be really integrated. So I do think there's some work really needed to look at how those housing needs assessments are done. And I'm fascinated, to be honest, the whole impact that COVID's going to have on housing need. So we've got, those folk that can work from home, take using Cardiff as an example, who would have previously have been commuting into Cardiff, or living in Cardiff because they didn't want to commute into Cardiff every day, now being told, well, you can work from home most of the days of the week. You might have to come into the office once or twice a week, maybe then looking to live outside the city because you can get a bigger house with more space for the home working, with more outside space, and so I think there's going to be potentially some really big shifts. And already the data for Cardiff has shown the projected population growth of the city is much, much smaller than it was a few years ago. So I think, and it's back to the resources and capacity and skills issue. I think there's going to be a need to be much more nimble on some of this stuff, and more kind of listening carefully and watching carefully to what's happening. There's a lot of big projects planned for Cardiff, and which involve housing, retail, and office space. And I mean, I'd love to be proved wrong, but I fear for some of them in a number of years that they won't be. Certainly, the office and retail may not be fully occupied, and the housing may. There's also the issue that you're not always meeting when you build homes. You're not always meeting the local need anyway. You're meeting investment needs, if you like, of folk as well. So it's back to that system need to have a look at the whole. And I suppose it's always an issue. You're looking at the whole system. Where do you start on the circle, as it were, to have impact?
Yeah. Thanks for raising the issue of COVID. I mentioned it at the beginning, and then let the discussion run without people explicitly articulating particular implications. And that's been a rare treat for these last 18 months. But you are right. I think apart from unburying the remaining problems, and as I see it in the context I work in Canada and Australia, there was already an ongoing shift out of the largest metropolitan areas to towns, driven by the affordability issues, particularly of younger professionals in metropolitan areas. COVID has reinforced that. I think the numbers of people who will actually move will, at the end of the day, be relatively modest, but there will be quite, in terms of metropolitan population being lost, but they'll be quite important in the places where they arrive. And the government of Nova Scotia, where I am just now, I have to look out the window to remember where I am. It's actually thinking about highlighting that there are 4 or 5 towns that are particularly good prospects to attract people from other parts of metropolitan Canada. I think Wales and Scotland should be thinking about that, just as an aside. But we're getting near the end of our time, and I'm going to ask Ashley, did you want to add something?
Yeah, I think there were some really interesting points raised there around the impact of COVID, about the kind of longer term impacts. Perhaps we're seeing some people who might want to be moving out of city centres, as Tamsin said, looking for country living, remote working. Is that going to be a long-term trend, or are we going to see more people moving into urban areas? David was talking about vacant and derelict land within town and city centres. How does that link in with the Scottish Government's commitment towards looking at 20-minute neighbourhoods and making sure that people are living within access of local amenities and not having to commute and not having to drive in and out of cities? I think that's really interesting. I was at a forum this morning about housing and dementia, and we were talking about the need for people to have a more considered approach to their perceptions of housing, I guess, and what they want from housing. So there's maybe this sort of perception that older people want to move out of the city when they retire, move to the countryside. Is that a good long-term plan for somebody, or should they be looking at accessibility in terms of local amenities and what's going to be there for them when they're maybe not as able to use public transport or their own transport? So how do we encourage people to think about housing earlier in life and think about their kind of longer term housing prospects, not just what their immediate needs are, but what they might be in 5, 10, 15, 20 years time? I think we've not really touched on this yet, but our population is growing older. We are committed, or the Scottish Government is committed to supporting people to live independently in their own homes. And are we really focusing enough on enabling people to do that? And there's again that link with health and social care and support services, and making sure that our homes are adaptable and accessible, and that we can meet changing needs over time as well. So I think that idea of a longer term housing journey is really interesting and something that we really need to focus on, encouraging people to think about for themselves.
Well, you don't need to encourage me, Ashley. I've been around a long time. And dementia may set in soon. But what I think the point you made, and came out what Tamsin said and David said, is government are pursuing a couple of big agendas here, and there's the process of COVID and people potentially decentralising. At the same time, almost all of the thinking in sustainable development would have people moving back towards city centres in hopefully decent and safe housing on vacant and derelict land. And that is a particularly big issue in the Scottish context because of particularly the Glasgow metropolitan area, the Glasgow city region. There are 2 of the areas in that local authorities that are still significantly declining, but yet the city centre has a huge amount of potentially developable land. So big difficulties and different trade-offs for carbon and 20-minute neighbourhoods and indeed decent housing. We've come to 12:30, and I'm sorry if I've not managed to involve everyone, particularly since I've spoken too much myself. But I want to thank all the panellists. Thank you for the discussion, and to Bob Smith and Pete Mackey, of course, who did the video, and Ken for their contributions, and Gareth, thanks to Cash for setting this up, and I hope people have found it useful. So thank you.